Hello, my name is Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator at Kansas City Public Schools. Today we're going to talk to you guys about the age of exploration. Why did it happen? Why did it need to happen? And basically, the outcome of it. We're going to go over basically the details of the age of exploration. What you need now, go grab a pencil, go grab some paper so we can talk about it. Alright, in the first part of this lesson, I'm going to discuss with you guys America with exploration. The Vikings were the first group to come here. Basically, we want to talk about the rationale why Europeans had to basically come over to North America and discover this new world. This is going to be our key questions. In the 1400s, there was little communication and trade over long distance, yet today it is hard to imagine a world without these things. How do you think countries benefit through these exchanges? How are these exchanges damaging? How do the restrictions of trade to the Far East help initiate the great age of exploration? So again, I told you guys, the Vikings had knowledge of North America in the 11th century, but there was little incentive basically for westward expansion to 1400s. The Vikings landed right here in Newfoundland. They were there, but they got chased off by the Native American tribes in the basically 11th century. Leif Erikson, that was his group. So with this, these people needed to trade with these people. After the Crusades, Europeans got this huge taste of luxury goods, luxury spices, and they knew that they wanted to keep trading with this group of people. But one thing that was hindering the trade was going through Muslim lands. Huge taxes would be on basically these luxury goods. So these Europeans want to think about a way where they can basically circumvent the Muslim lands to get over to these places like India, basically China, because they want these luxury goods. Think about this. You got a luxury good in your home, like fine china. Guess where it came from? It comes from China, right? So, the Iberian Peninsulas, Portugal and Spain, these guys start thinking, how can we get around not paying these high taxes through these Muslim lands and basically create an opportunity for us to dominate the world? So they got smart about it. So they discovered basically we can sail around basically the world to get over to where we need to get to. Because these spices were good. The Crusades allowed these people to taste these fine spices. They had these luxury goods on their mind. They wanted gold. They wanted chocolate. They wanted all these good things. So how did they get to it without going through these Muslim lands? So they knew if they get to these lands, they had to basically start spreading their religion. Catholicism was huge during this time frame. The Crusades fostered this renewed interest of goods from Asia. Exploration basically motivated long rivalries in European states. And they want to expand their dominance in these areas. So what I do, I teach the 3 G's. We're going to talk, not the 3 G's from what you guys used to, Snoop Dogg, Ice Cube, and Dr. Dre. We're going to talk about the 3 different G's. We're going to talk about gold, God, and glory. Alright? The duty, basically, of a Christian was to spread this religion. Most Europeans still practice mercantilism. What is mercantilism? Basically, it's the wealth of a nation in gold and silver and acquiring colonies to preserve the wealth. So, Europeans, they basically were growing. They were living right on top of each other. So, the population of growth and commercial prosperity and development of powerful nation states led to the age of exploration. The arrival of the age of exploration happened in the 14th and 15th centuries. It's triggered based by demographic and social change. New ships helped explore that, push that to this new age of exploration. The caravel, the kayak, and the flute basically created this. These ships could carry basically goods long periods. They can carry cattle. They can carry livestock. They're versatile. So, how do we get started on this age of exploration? Prince Henry, he the navigator, organized voyages along the coast of Africa seeking a water route to Asia. Along that route, he would set up these different forts. So it was the Europeans that actually we're going to say it's the Portuguese that actually started slave trade. As you can see, as they started setting up these different forts, by 1500, Pedro Cabral basically accidentally discovered Brazil. So remember, Brazil is the only Portuguese nation. Let me start that.
Okay. All right. Let's just start there. Here we go. 3, 2.
All right. So along the coast of Africa, they started building these forts. Remember, the Portuguese started basically the slave trade. Portuguese established these forts on the coast of Africa, as you can see. You have Fort Innis, Fort Diaz, basically in 1445. Cal, basically in 1482. Gomez, 1456. Cal, basically in 1486. So we have these different forts. They're setting up these trading ports. So along these forts, they started trading for gold and slaves. So along this coast, you have to understand that this basically set up the Portuguese Empire. So, by 1500, the Portuguese actually touched the New World. This happened by accident with Pedro Cabral. He was actually trying to go all the way over here, but he messed up and went to the New World. Portugal basically only had one possession in the New World, and that's Brazil. Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking country in the New World. They held on to that possession all the way to the 1890s. So, by accident, they got this huge territory in the New World. As you can see, their focus is on the Old World. They're focused on places like Macau. They're from Calcutta. They're focused on Colombo. They're focused on Mozambique. This is the area that they're focusing on. They're focused on the Old World. While Spain, they wanted to focus on the New World. By 1492, Spain fully funded Columbus's voyages. Basically, it was newly unified Spain eager to compete with Portugal. No longer were they in a civil war. They wanted to compete with Portugal and basically expanded their territory. They knew that they needed to get more ground. They needed to get more territory. Because again, the Iberian Peninsula is a small piece of land compared to the rest of the world. 1499, Amerigo Vespucci mapped and described the New World. The Americas is named after Amerigo Vespucci. His voyages are sponsored by Spain. All these Italians started going to Spain to get their voyages funded. Ferdinand Magellan, sponsored by Spain, he was the first one to circumvent the whole world. By 1494, there was something coming, and the Pope knew it. So what the Pope decided to do, it was to orchestrate the Treaty of Tordesillas. Basically, created a lot of demarcation and separating the Spanish parts and the Portuguese parts in the world. Again, Portugal, the only thing they wanted was Brazil in the New World. Their focus is on the Old World. And again, that was the biggest doom when it starts to come in with other European competitors to the world. Because guess what? They had to compete with the Dutch, the English, and the Old World. Eventually, they fell off, and basically Spain still had territories in this New World and getting gold and all that stuff sent back to the Old World. So as we keep going into this, we had two questions at the beginning. In the 1400s, there were little communications and trade over long distance, yet it's hard to imagine a world without these things. How do countries benefit from these exchanges? And how are these exchanges damaging? Alright, so this is what we could put. Countries could benefit from international trade by being able to obtain goods and services that were previously unavailable. This allowed for increased communication. People benefit from insights in traditional literature, sciences. Alright, on the negative side, world trade has benefited from exploitation of labor. We're going to talk a lot about slave labor, especially in this new world. Alright, environmental destructions, opening new avenues of communication. We can actually talk about how TV and radio basically was a form of exploration into this new world. So to answer our second question, how did the restrictions of trade in the Far East help initiate the Great Age of Exploration? You remember Europeans upper class developed this huge taste for these luxury goods, right? On demand, they want existed these luxury items from Asia, spices, jewels, silks, porcelain. But they didn't want to pay the tax to the Italians. They didn't want to pay the tax to the Muslims. So the both the basically Spanish and the Portuguese developed new trade routes. They wanted to bypass those two. They knew that they didn't want to pay those taxes to get all the way to Western Europe. So the age of exploration basically helped create this whole new territory, these whole new avenues of new trading cities, new trading ports, new forts throughout the world. They found new trading partners. So now, I want you guys at home, I want you to look in your cabinet. I want you to look at some of your spices from basically what you got in your cabinet and decide, look, do some research. I want you to look about, see where they came from. How did they get here how they get here to the United States? Then I want you basically we're going to talk a little bit about this next week as we start pushing on European incursions in Native American territories. I'm Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator. See you guys next week. Welcome back to Homeroom. My name is Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator for Kansas City Public Schools. Today, we're here to talk about radical Reconstruction, the benefits of the South, what happened in the aftermath of the Reconstruction, and basically moving forward. Today, you're going to need a pen and paper. Let's get started. So, what do we know so far about radical Reconstruction? Well, what do we know so far about Reconstruction period? We know that Abraham Lincoln died in 1865. And basically, we know he was replaced by President Johnson. Remember, President Johnson didn't have too many friends. He was one of the original guys from the South that stayed with the Union. That's what made him basically a good vice president and helped keep the Union together. The questions that we're going to answer today. What was the legal and constitutional issues that arose basically after the war? What should be done with the free blacks in the South after the Civil War? And how and should the Southern states be reintegrated back into the Union? And what should be done with President Davis and other Confederate leaders after the Civil War? And who would lead this Reconstruction effort? So, we're going to get started with radical Reconstruction. 1867, the United States was, the South was broke up into 5 distinct districts. Basically, these districts were run by the military. Basically, they ran the Freedmen's Bureau. They ran all these organizations that basically promote black help in the South. So these organizations, they were run by generals. General Schofield ran basically 1. General Sickles ran 2. General Pope ran 3. And that's this large portion over here, which is talking about Alabama, Georgia, and basically Florida. General Orden ran 4. That's going to talk about today's Arkansas and Mississippi. And 5 was run by General Sheridan. Basically, that was today's Texas. So the radical Republicans. Let's talk about Thaddeus Stevens was the leader of them. This is Thaddeus Stevens. Basically, he thought Lincoln was too lenient, basically, on the Confederacy. He thought they should pay a higher price. He thought 50% of them basically need to take a loyalty oath, basically, to the Union. So this basically was a huge deal. Because you remember Lincoln's plan, only 10% had to take this oath, right? Loyal to the Constitution of the United States. But the radical Republicans, they wanted 50% of the population to do so, right? So, when Johnson took over after Lincoln died in 1865, he ran with Lincoln's plan. You remember, he vetoed basically all these Republican-backed bills. As Republicans started sending these bills up for civil rights, basically for black suffrage and all this other stuff, he was vetoing these bills, right? So, he wasn't too popular. Remember, most of those states in the South, they hadn't came back into the Union yet. So, again, this whole process was basically just, drawn out process to get them back into the Union. He entered the Freedmen's Bureau, right? He told them no. He basically was not a friend of the black man. He was telling them that basically they're good. He said, let the states handle it. Again, he was more of a states' rights guy compared to the radical Republicans. You remember, African Americans were loyal to the Republican Party close to 100 years after the Civil War. It went until basically 1965 where you started seeing that switch for African Americans move to the Democratic Party, right? So, what should the radical Republicans do? Election was coming up. 1866 was a huge year in American history, right? The next 2 years in American history were huge. From 1867 to 1869 were huge. So, 1866, Republicans had this huge landslide. So more come to basically to the House of Representatives, to the Senate. Guess what happened? So now, see all these bills are getting vetoed by Johnson. He had the highest veto percentage of any president so far, right? It was some 71%. Basically more than anybody put like Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln all put together. So, Republicans sought to expand their power. That's what they did. As all these new basic congressmen started coming in, they had a veto-proof power. So, guess what? If Johnson vetoes a bill, they could get it passed again because they had a veto-proof power. They basically, the South now wanted political power, right? Guess what? All these people in the South, now you have African Americans started coming about. You have, these white people just coming about because they took the oath. Said, you know what? I'm taking an oath to the United States. So they started wanting more power too. Then they ended up trying to remove the president from his position. We're going to talk about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. So, let's get started. Constitutional issues that came up, right? The 13th Amendment. This ended slavery in 1865. So now, emancipation happened, right? After the Civil War. Remember in the South, as they started going through the South, those slave states basically started coming over. Now, we're talking about those border states, places like Missouri. They actually had to abide by the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, right? The 14th Amendment came in 1868. They gave black citizenships, right? So we talk about, Plessy versus Ferguson. That's going to happen in the future. But we're going to talk about all these other things that have happened. This is black gaining their citizenships basically under the Constitution with the 14th Amendment. This becomes huge moving forward in history. We're going to talk about gay rights. We're going to talk about all these other rights. We're going to talk about basically women when they gain the right to vote. This all happened because of the 14th Amendment, guys. The 14th Amendment is probably the most important amendment in the United States, right? Under the Constitution. The 15th Amendment. This gave black men the right to vote. This also, we lost some allies during this process too. It happens a lot, guys. Sometimes, one set gets like the right to vote or something like that. Other people can become upset because they're not getting the same rights, right? So let's talk about the unintended consequences, especially with the 15th Amendment. Unintended consequences, basically, understand that the abolitionist movement, this movement happens from all the way, the freedom of slavery happens from start like of the United States in 1770s, right? This movement was basically trying to free blacks, right? And it was women that helped lead in this process. Women will help lead in this process, right? But black men gained the right to vote. Oh crap, stop.
What happened?
I started scrolling down.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Go back on that one.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to this one.
All right, here we go. 3, 2.
So let's talk about the unintended consequences of the 15th Amendment. Understand that women were part of this abolitionist movement, right? They wanted blacks, to be free. They wanted all this stuff. But women won the right to vote, especially white women. It's true. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all these other movements and these leaders, basically, they won the right to vote. African American men gained the right to vote in 1869, right? So, this infuriated the movement. So, a lot of your leading, basically, women's rights movers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and all these other figures, they basically turned against this. They didn't want that to happen first. So they were friends with people like Frederick Douglass. And you saw this, basically, this clash. As Frederick Douglass said, yes, they are my friends. He says, my people come first. So you saw the split when it came to basically the black movement compared to the women's rights movement. So now former allies become enemies through this whole process. Now let's talk about basically about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson basically, Again, nobody liked Andrew Johnson. People in the South thought he was a snake. People in the North didn't trust him. So now, where's his political base? He really didn't have one, right? So, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. It started, basically, he fired Edwin Stanton. When he fired Edwin Stanton was basically, he was the Secretary of War. The Secretary of War was basically telling Congress that this guy can't be trusted. He's basically a spy for the Congress, right? For the radical Republicans. He was a spy for the radical Republicans. So understand that Andrew Johnson didn't trust him. So he fired him from the cabinet. So once he did that, that triggered basically a congressional review, congressional basically investigation. So once that happened, the radical Republicans knew that they had blood in the water. All this other good stuff that happened basically during the Johnson years. When we talk about the end of French hopes in Mexico, the review of the Grand Army in 1865, the purchase of basically Alaska from Russia in 1867, the Nebraska being admitted to basically the Union in 1867, the Reconstruction period, the amendments getting passed, the Civil War amendments, and the Great Eastern Atlantic Cable in 1865, that all happened during his administration. So all the good that we talked about, that he may have done while he was the president, basically went out the window. So Congress ended up impeaching him, right? The House of Representatives, they said, you know what, we're going to send him to trial. The Senate, led by 7 Republicans, decided not to convict him. Those 7 Republicans never ran for office again. Their political career was over. The party was done with them, right? So those guys were done. But he was still the president for the next few years, right? He was a weak president. Congress basically had a veto-proof margins so they could go around him. They didn't need a president during this time. He was a weak president. He was wounded. So we know about Reconstruction. We know what happened with Lincoln. We know what happened with Johnson. We know what happened with the radical Republicans getting the Civil War amendments passed. We talked about Thaddeus Stevens, right? So let's talk about the lasting impact of Reconstruction. Let's talk about the short-term gains for African Americans. Remember, we had our first African American congressman, right? And this was huge. We basically taught lots of African Americans, over 200,000 African Americans, how to read and how to write. So the short-term gains are huge, right? But the long-term impact basically was one of poverty. We're going to talk about the sharecropping system, correct? The sharecropping system, remember we talked about that a week and a half ago. The sharecropping system, basically, people were bonded to the land. So the lasting impact becomes over 100 years. So it's a reason we're going to talk about the Civil Rights Amendment in the 1960s. Because the sharecropping system basically left people bonded to the land. So it's much like slavery, but a little bit different, correct? So, let's answer some questions, right? What was the legal and constitutional issues that arose after the war? We're going to talk about basically black male suffrage, right? African Americans gained the right to vote. Great issue, right? Then we're going to talk about the women's rights issue. White women didn't get the right to vote till 1920, correct? Then, did the lives of free blacks improve during Reconstruction? For the short term, yes, right? The short term, they did improve, correct? But on a long-term period, we still had to basically have the civil rights movement close to 100 years down the road. What happened to the old Confederate members after the Civil War? So with the 14th Amendment, remember that one gave African Americans the right to citizenship, right? But the 14th Amendment also stripped away the Confederacy's basically right to vote. So if you were like, Jefferson Davis, he lost his right to vote. He lost his right to be basically a citizen of the United States, right? To participate in open elections. So that's what happened to the old Confederacy, right? So they actually lost their rights as men to be a part of the United States. Comparing the two plans, which one was more effective? Compare Lincoln's plan compared to Congress' plan, the radical Republican plan, right? Which one would you think is more effective? Personally, I like the aggressiveness of the radical Republican plan. They basically wanted to punish the South, which they ended up doing. But in the long term, it ended up hurting them, right? Because those state legislatures, as they kept coming back above, they started denying African Americans the right to vote. They started denying African Americans the right for employment. So then we talked about the Jim Crow system that started coming back because of that, right? So The Radical Republican plan was great for the short time. For long-term periods, I can understand what Lincoln was thinking. He wanted to keep that Union together. So, we talked about radical reconstruction. We talked about what happened to the former Confederates after the war. We talked about the aftermath of Reconstruction. Now, this is what I want you to do. This is what you're going to do, right? You're going to look at the legacy of Reconstruction. Write one paragraph over some things that left basically over from American society over Reconstruction. I want you to think about some of those things. I want you to think about some of the racist attitudes that start coming forward because the legacy of Reconstruction. I'm Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator. Today we talked about radical Reconstruction. We talked about basically how it wrapped up. We talked about the long-term impact of radical Reconstruction. Now, I want you to think about that as we go forward and how that affects American society. Talk to you guys next week. Welcome to Homeroom. I'm Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator, KCPS Public Schools. Today we're going to talk about westward expansion, basically for the period from 1877 to 1898. The lead up to westward expansion, new technology that was introduced to the West, and what happened to the Native Americans that were living out west. You need a pen and paper? Let's get started. So, our essential questions. We're going to explain the causes and effects of settlement in the West from 1870 to 1898. And what was the government response to the Native Americans that was occupying the land during this time period? So, the new technology. There was a whole lot of new technology that was introduced. We're going to talk about the refrigerated car. We're going to talk about all that good stuff, right? But the biggest one was the railroad, right? In the late 1800s, the railroad basically allowed the United States to go from sea to signing sea, right? We basically let them manifest destiny, right? 1862, Congress got involved. Once Congress got involved, this basically led to western expansion. This led to places like Nebraska, places like Missouri to get a huge population, right? Because now you can get back and forth basically in a quicker manner with the railroad, right? 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act. 4 of the 5 transcontinental railroads were built by 1890. So, as this became a part of the process, you start seeing basically people realizing there's more opportunity out west. More opportunity out west basically helped drive the population to move to the west. The biggest thing what the railroad did was create jobs and economic growth. Again, these guys were getting paid 5 miles a day. They were laying these tracks, but they were getting paid pretty good money. If I'm an immigrant, I'm foreshadowing that. If I'm an immigrant, this is good money for me. I'm coming to the United States, basically not knowing anybody. I can find a job on the railroad, right? And then Congress was not getting involved. They're basically practicing laissez-faire economics. What's laissez-faire economics? Basically, that's no government regulation on the railroad system. So now, if I'm a venture capitalist, if I'm somebody who has a lot of money, I can get involved in building these small railroads, right? Leading me all the way to the west. This is how people start building wealth. As we talk about the Gilded Age, as we're moving forward, part of this process, this basically generated people with lots of money, right? We'll talk about the Rockefellers. We're going to talk about, all these big capitalists. We're going to talk about J.P. Morgan. They were all involved in this process. So let's talk about the Irish immigrants. Basically, these guys were coming in basically to the United States. Railroad people was, looking for new bodies to come help build this road. This was taxing work. They were laying 5 miles a day on tracks, right? So you had to be big, you had to be strong. You got to be good. You earn pretty good money too by doing this. So if you're new to America, this is a great opportunity for you. So you start seeing a lot of Irish immigrants. So we start seeing a lot of Irish immigrants actually populating places like Nebraska, places like Wyoming, because they were on the railroad working. They saw this as a great opportunity to basically live that American dream that everybody was looking for. Asian immigrants, they populated on the West Coast, right? So you start seeing Asian immigrants basically building tracks from the West Coast to basically to Middle America, and then they end up meeting. Correct? So as this process started drawing on, you start seeing new Americans basically have an economic impact on building the railroad. 1869, they finished in Promontory Point, Utah, where they drove the final nail in, right? So, the good thing is, the railroad touched most of America. As you can see, these are all railroad lines. The Union Pacific, right? This is the biggest one. This is the one that Congress basically was involved in. They basically started in Nebraska. They started basically on the West Coast, the Sacramento, California, right? They met in Utah, drove on the final nail, Promontory Point, right? Then you have the Great Northern Railroad. That was the north, basically leading you up to like places like Washington, leading you up to Oregon, right? Then you have the Northern Pacific. That led you through Minnesota, right?
What's the town? Is that your phone?
No. I don't know what that was.
Let's go, just go back one slide.
Let's go back one slide, okay.
Alright, here we go.
Alright.
3, 2.
Okay, when Congress passed the Railroad Act, basically you start to see a lot of immigrants get involved basically with this American dream. Because the railroads actually paid pretty good. They built 5 miles per day on track, right? But it was back-breaking work. You just had to drive those nails in the ground. So you had to be a pretty young man to do it. Old fogey like me, you know what? I'm not going to do it, right? Because I got a bad back. But a young guy, about 19, Irish immigrant, right? This would be a great opportunity for him. Plus, he gets to see the new layout of this new land that he's immigrated to. Irish immigrants on the West Coast, right? Basically, Irish came into the West Coast. They found the Asians came to the West Coast. They saw this as a good opportunity for them. So, we're going to talk about the Union Pacific. They have one part that started in Sacramento, California. One part started in Omaha, Nebraska. They met up in Utah, basically driving their final nail in. So, this railroad was finally finished in 1869. It was basically started in 1862. So, it took about 7 years for it to get started. Finally finished, excuse me. So, let's look at these railroads. We're going to talk about the Union Pacific. That was the one that we just talked about. Congress authorized that in 1862. They started in Omaha, Nebraska, right? These guys started in basically Sacramento, California. They met in Utah to drive that final nail in. These people on the West Coast had to go through mountains, they had to blow up. It was a dangerous job because they had to build all this stuff. Plus, these guys had to deal with the Native Americans that was on that land already. That becomes another issue that we move forward in. Then you talk about basically Northern Pacific Railroad. This one basically went through Minnesota, went to North Dakota, basically went to Montana, met up with the Great Northern Railroad. That was was in Washington, went through Oregon. So all these started linking up. Then down in the South, you have the Southern Lines. That linked to basically the whole American South. This actually helped the American South basically get back on its feet. Remember, we talked about the collapse of the cotton industry. This helped the American South get back on their feet. Then you talk about the Santa Fe Railroad. That happened in basically New Mexico. That basically linked up to the Southern railroads. So all these people who were selling in the West basically were able to link up with the railroad system. Now we're going to talk about new technologies such as telegraph and all that good stuff. That helped because of the railroad system. Because these people were starting to migrate to this area, correct? So you have the telegraph. Now you can get news from the West Coast, from the East Coast to the West Coast. That also led us into time zones, right? Now, I can set up different time zones. Basically, 4 different time zones was created because of the railroad. The railroad was huge. It was basically the biggest thing that happened since cell phones, right? You know how we think about cell phones? About 10 years ago, nobody had a smartphone. Now everybody has a smartphone, right? That was the railroad system. That was that new technology. Again, before the railroads hit, basically, these lands were untouched. These lands were untouched. These Native American populations lived on them for years and years and years, right? Life after the Civil War changed basically the life of Native Americans in the plains because people started migrating to these areas. And this led to competition for land. You had competition between the Native American groups among themselves. You had competition between the now white settlers in these groups. And you had competition basically from Mexicans, right? Mexico was basically still part of this process. So now we basically have this huge internal conflicts because these lands belong to people during that time frame. All right. So I want you to understand that not all Native Americans are the same group. The Sioux, for instance, basically, they were growing. They were huge. They were running places basically from all the way from Missouri down to this area. That was the Sioux area, right? They were growing. This was their land. They was like, yo, this belongs to us, right? But the government, once they started sending settlers to the east, life started to change for the Native American population. No longer could they have free roam. They would start sent to reservations. They started becoming forced assimilated. It was brutal how basically the government started acting on them, right? So it was very brutal. They started being encroached on even when they basically signed these treaties with the American government. Still, the white settlers would still come and encroach on their lands, and this would create basically a huge war that was waged close to to 1900. So, we're going to talk about General George Custer. He found land basically in South Dakota. So once he found gold, people was like, whoa, he found gold out there. So you started seeing all these people basically flock on these Native American lands. Again, the Sioux, they was on these reservations because they were forced to sign these treaties with the United States government. So once that happened, we had warfare and carnage of basically a huge capacity. The Native Americans had to respond because the white men were basically encroaching on their land. Their lifestyle had changed. Remember, they were chasing the buffalo, right? So now the federal government sent hunters out there, basically slaughtered the whole buffalo. By 1900, there was less than 1,000 buffalo roaming wild in the West. So life was changing for the Native Americans. Again, they were forced to sign treaties. They were forced to assimilate. So these forced treaties basically pushed them to reservations. Once they got pushed on the reservations, nobody really cared about them, right? The federal government still had Indian agents going back and forth, but they were basically trying to assimilate these people. They were sending their kids to these schools run by Christian missionaries. They were cutting their hair, changing the language, and basically changing their names. No longer were they the person they grew up as. Now they become Western assimilated, right? And there was huge atrocities that were happening in these schools too. Huge abuse and huge trauma. Native Americans didn't gain citizenship till 1924. That's another huge issue. They were the first ones here, but they didn't get citizenships till 1924. So now I want you to think about this whole process. We're going to talk what happened to the Native Americans. They got pushed, right, to these reservations, correct? Now their life has changed. No longer are they chasing the buffaloes anymore. So let's answer some questions together. Explain the causes and effects of settlements in the West from 1877 to 1898. The railroad, right? The railroad opened up the lands in the West for settlers to push out to the West. What was the government response to Native American populations that occupied the Western lands? You remember, they forced them to sign treaties. They forced assimilation on them. They basically forced their whole lifestyle to change. They killed the buffalo off, basically, so people can settle those lands. Now, I want you to do this. What other groups would you say have the same treatment as Native American population? Do you think this treatment is just a part of the American culture? Or we, as people? I want you to write one-page paragraph explaining your thoughts on this process. Basically, who else was treated like this throughout basically history that we already discussed? Compare and contrast those two. Think about that as a long-term impact going forward based on United States history. I'm Paul Turner. Today we talked about new technologies to open up the West. We talked about the economic impact that will open up the West. We talked about changing the lifestyles of Native American culture through opening up the West with the federal government's response to new technology. Thank you for coming to Homeroom. See you guys next week. Welcome to Homeroom. I'm KC Public Schools Social Studies Coordinator Paul Turner. Today we're going to talk about Open Up the West. Why it was important, basically who benefited from it, and basically who suffered from Open Up the West. Again, you'll need a pencil and paper and ready to learn. Today's objective, we're going to explain the causes and the effects of the settlement in the West from 1877 to 1898. Why was this important? But again, we're going to talk about the positive changes, the progress, the growth, and the negatives and open up the West. Who was moving to the West? Who was not moving to the West? And why were they moving? Why was it important for these people to basically migrate in the West? And did America fulfill its dream of immigrants? Basically, the immigrants, when they came, did they fulfill the American dream? These are all important questions that we have to answer throughout this lesson. So, we're going to start off. 1862 was a huge year. Again, we got the Civil War going on. We had all this other stuff going on. And again, a lot of these cities are basically just sprawling out, right? You got a lot of these new immigrants coming to the United States trying to vilify this American dream, correct? But they didn't have land in basically these big cities. So you saw a lot of these Irish immigrants who were coming to the United States basically decided with this Homestead Act where they were giving away free land, 160 acres. What can you do with 160 acres today, right? They can go basically make these farms nice, basically plantable, right? And they can live this American dream. And again, the high prices of wheat, people wanted bread, right? So wheat was high right now. So the price of wheat, so I go there, basically go cut some grass down, make some wheat, I can make a lot of money. That was all good. So think about this time frame. From 1877 to 1898, you have over 500,000 families moving to the West. And when I say the West, I'm talking about modern day places like Oklahoma, Kansas, Wyoming, places like that, right? Like Nebraska too, because these places are newfound land. If I'm an immigrant, I can make a lot of money off this 168 if I farm it right. And remember, a lot of these immigrants are coming from farming territories from Europe. Okay, we're going to talk about Frederick Jackson Turner. He was a historian, and he defined this American West as a rugged, a rough area, right? And he came up with this thesis. For America to reach its greatness, it had to basically take this land and basically create it and cultivate it, right? But it's also going to do harm because it's going to harm the natural beauty of basically cultivating this land. What you did. So, why would I go to the West? Maybe I'm looking for something different, right? You remember, there's really no safety valve in American society. So there's no upward mobility, correct? So I'm living in these cities. It's a rough area to live in. Again, I have to deal with, pollution. I have to deal with traffic. I have to, like the traffic like we deal today. But, these tenement buildings where there's a lot of people. So if I move west, I can get 168 free acres of land from the federal government. So this is huge. Why people would want to go west. That's one of those push and pull factors, right? That we talked about earlier. And again, it was mostly immigrants who were heading out there. Irish, right? The Germans started coming over. This is where they were landing, right? So this provided these guys ample opportunity to live that land, live off the agriculture, what they were doing back in their home countries. Again, if I'm in a city though, I have industry that was keeping me afloat. I have basically, I'll come over here, my cousin's already over here, he can hook me up with a job in one of these manufacturing plants, right? So the city provided people like a safety net for them. In the West, to provide that, this sense of excitement. I can build my own. I can create my own wealth in American society. I can basically create my own American dream if I moved out west. We start talking about California, we're going to talk about the gold rush and all that good stuff. That's one of those pull factors to the west. Because think about it. I can go find some gold and I can become rich overnight. Wow, that's really interesting. So, maintaining the beauty of the West. There was a lot of corporate interest in moving west. Because you have these waterways, you have these ponds. They wanted to basically own those rights. Then you're going to see the start of conservation movement. Okay? If I own a farm, I still need water, right? We have to understand that the West is rugged. It's tough during this time frame. So I have to build my own basically way to get water to my land. But if I'm corporate, I have money to get to that land, right? So I can basically bring water in. So you have these corporate interests versus basically these small town farmer interests. So you start seeing this conservation movement coming about. They want to protect the beauty of these lands, right? So let's talk about the national park movement. 1872, Yellowstone basically becomes the first national park in the United States, right? By 1890, you have Yosemite and Sequoia, basically in the west, basically become these federal protected lands. So again, we wanted to protect the beauties of the west, right? Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis was correct. You had to tame the west basically for America to reach its greatness. He was correct on that. He was absolutely correct on that. That thesis basically is what basically helped push us forward, basically become this great, mighty power that we are. Alright? So, do we really need more farmers? By the time of 1880s, 1890s, we had some things going on. You had new technologies coming about. You started seeing like the tractors, the plows, all those good stuff basically becoming mechanized. Again, we're going through a technology revolution during this time frame. So again, that affected farming. So do we need as many farmers as basically these 500,000 families that moved west? Think about that question. Then you have basically these farmers who relied on a single crop. That's what damaged most of these families from becoming these big-time farmers. Some of these farmers have been farming these lands today from the 1870s, 1860s, right? A lot of these families lost everything because they were single crop farmers. That's one thing that they did when they moved out there because that's what they were used to, basically in the old country. If I'm coming from Ireland or Irish, if I'm Irish, I'm used to doing a potato, right? So that's all I really know. If I'm coming from the American South, I might try to do cotton. That's all I know, right? So a lot of these families, they didn't know about this thing about, diversifying your crops. How about crop rotation? They didn't know about this stuff. So when they went out there, literally they lasted about 2 to 5 years and they were done. They were done with farming because they didn't know how to basically do diverse crops and basically take care of their land. Then you had price drops by the 1890s. That affected farming a lot. A lot of farmers realized that it's not economical to basically become farmers, right? They realized that all this crops and all this time that they're putting in the land, they're losing money on. They had high debts. They had to pay these debts back to the bank. So banks was basically started calling their loans on some of these lands. So some of these farmers went bankrupt, right? Then we forgot about this thing called droughts. If I don't have any water, guess what? My plants are not growing, correct? My land is basically tough. It's going to be a rough year for me. Then we have to start dealing with things like grasshoppers and other things. So it was rough being a farmer from this time frame. Let's do a knowledge check. Can we explain the causes and effects of settlement in the West from 1877, 1898? Let's think about that. The Homestead Act of 1862 basically was enticing for people to move out to the Midwest and out to the West, right? They provided an opportunity to build wealth. Excitement, you remember? I can become rich on my own. I don't need my cousin to basically give me a job at the factory in the city. This all became great opportunities for these people to move out west. Alright, so failure to launch. Again, 1880s and 1870s, you have these huge grasshopper plagues. Basically, if I'm planting like beans or something else, beans or corn, the grasshoppers are coming to eat them up. Every summer, it happened numerous of times in the summertime. Then you had thousands of farm failures. Basically, people went bankrupt. So people basically lost everything that they had. Then many blamed on the railroads because railroad prices were high. The railroads knew they could take advantage of these farmers. Then you had high taxes too. Many of these local governments basically had high taxes on these farmers. So they decided to get political. A lot of these organizations basically came together and created these cooperatives. The Grange movement was one of the first ones. Their ultimate goal was to improve lives of farmers. Basically, they had over 800,000 members, and this was in the 1860s and 1870s. Then you had other movements such as the Greenback movement. Basically, they wanted to reform basically the way that we replenish our money. You had the Farmer Alliance. These people was basically a social organization. Basically help farmers improve their lives and create these social organizations for that to happen. And create political organizations too. Then you have the Color Farmer Alliance. Basically, they have the same mission as the Farmer Alliance. So you start seeing these organizations are reformed. These populist organizations knew that they need political clout to build upon basically this movement that was growing. So let's do the we do. Let's answer some of these questions. In what ways can change, progress, and growth be positive, negative? Again, we talked about open up the West, right? So when we open up the West, it provides people opportunity. Positive, it allows people to basically get rich, right? Some of the negatives, we had over thousands and thousands of these bank failures. Who was moving west and who was not? And why were they moving? Again, you had immigrants moving west, right? You had these people allowed them to do what they did in their own country, basically when they moved west. All right? Who's not moving west? Well, let's talk about who was not moving west. Basically, if I'm basically a rich guy on the East Coast, I'm not moving west. I might have a business out west, but I'm not moving. You remember the railroad provided ample opportunity for them to get out west, right? Did America fulfill the dream of immigrants? In some ways it did. You remember some people were able to basically live on this land from 1860 till today, still farming. You talk about places like North Dakota, South Dakota. Some of those families have been basically farming that land since those times. So we're talking about close to 140 years of some of these families basically doing this work for that same land. So now we're in the now you do. I want you to brainstorm some ideas of American history. How was the opening of the West important going forward in American society? Think about that. I want you to think about it. Let's start foreshadowing and basically start thinking about what's going forward in American society. Who is benefiting from moving west? Who is benefiting from that? We talk about the immigrants, right? What other groups are benefiting from moving west? Railroads, right? Did the average American gain wealth from moving west? Answer that question. My name is Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator, Kansas City Public School. I'll see you guys next week.
am Lincoln Middle.
At Lincoln Middle School, students discover their talents and passions, where teachers plant the seeds of lifelong learning,
I am Lincoln Middle.
where excellence is nurtured. Students develop the skills to be successful in school, career, and beyond.
Je suis Lincoln Middle.
Lincoln Middle is the public school where your child will thrive and grow. Open a world of possibilities. Apply today. Learn more at enrollkc.org/Lincoln Middle.
The desire to create lives within each of us. From Grammy-winning producers and musicians, to NBA stars, to Navy admirals and Medal of Honor recipients, to internationally renowned artists, and beloved local muralists, Paseo graduates have been creating their own success, their own history, their own legacy since 1926. Now it's your time. Create your future at Paseo Academy of Fine and Performing Arts. Learn more at enrollkc.org/Paseo.